It is such a joy to see everyone here today. I'm just so happy to see all these beautiful faces in this place on this day. So excited to celebrate 7 years of New Day Church. It's been the greatest blessing in my life after marriage and children. It's just really awesome to experience. I just learned this week that 2 of our members have been accepted into seminary and have gotten huge scholarships. Both of them got wonderful scholarships. And it just struck me that over the last 5 years, 5 members of New Day Church have gone to seminary. The 2 that I want to lift up today, Alexis Francisco and Nora Cunningham, have both been accepted. Keisha is also a student at Union Seminary. Lisa's doing her doctorate at Drew. But what that says to me is that symbolic of the way that people are stepping up. And we've seen this over 7 years. We've seen folks, Alexis came in these doors like 3 years ago and wasn't really sure why he was in church. And now he's moving towards seminary because there's a transforming power that happens when we're able to enter into the authenticity of a relationship with God and a community of faith. And so I'm so grateful. I'm so awed by what God is doing among us. I came in this morning about 9:30, and this place probably already had 60 people in it, rehearsing music and setting up tables and getting ready for the service, rehearsing the scripture. So it's just really a blessing to see people come together and really take on what it means to be beloved community. You know how we need beloved community in this world. We gather together to worship God, to be fully immersed in the fullness of the source of love, our God. This morning, we're going to focus on what is most important, and that's really what we do all the time, but we're going to be explicit this morning about what is most important. Let me know if this resonates with you, these words of Ian Thomas. And every day, the world will drag you by the hand, yelling, "This is important, this is important, this is important. You need to worry about this, and this, and this." And every day, it's important to take your hand back and put it on your heart and say, "No, this is important." So I want to invite us to put our hands on our hearts and take a deep breath in and look deeply into your soul and ask, what is most important? What do you see in there? Your health? I've discovered that my health takes more and more work these days. Financial stability? Meaning? Finding your deepest purpose? Making an impact in the world? Let us just continue to think about that as we move through this message. We heard the scriptures this morning. A lawyer came and asked Jesus that very question. What matters most? What is most important? They were enough impressed by who he was and what they saw happening around him that they came to him and said, what is the most important commandment? What's most important of all? And Jesus said very clearly and simply, love God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Love, love, love is what matters most. I don't know if you agree. Let's think about that as we move through today. You know, some of us have been hurt by love. We live in a culture, a consumer culture, and many times love feels like a commodity. It's something we're attracted to. It's something we feel we have to attain. So it may be that the question, what is most important, and whether we agree that love is the most important, may depend on how we understand love. What is love? So I want to look this morning deeply at 3 ways to love. And these are ways that flow particularly out of this scripture reading this morning. Loving God with all our heart, loving our neighbor as ourselves. And the 3 ways of love I want to look at are, first of all, crossing boundaries. Love crosses boundaries. If it doesn't cross boundaries, it's not love. Jesus crossed every boundary in his society. And in this particular teaching, he says, love your neighbor as yourself. That's that fundamental crossing of boundaries from self to other, crossing that boundary from self to all others, crossing boundaries. And then the second way of love is setting boundaries. After we cross the artificial boundaries of division that tear us apart, then we can begin to establish boundaries of respect, real, authentic boundaries about what's okay and about what's not okay. I mean, to illustrate that there's no contradiction between crossing boundaries and setting boundaries, think about the eternal conversation around the toilet seat. Will it be up or will it be down? Right? Now, first of all, you've got to cross the boundary of gender. If you're going to stay locked in your gender perspective, there's going to be no dialogue. So you got to cross that boundary. And then once you've crossed the boundary, then you got to set a boundary. Have a conversation. How many times are you mad at somebody and you never even talked about beforehand what you're mad about? Why can't they read my mind? Don't they know that irritates me? Crossing boundaries and setting boundaries. And then finally, once we've established these boundaries, we've created a channel where love can flow. And the nature of love is that it flows freely, it flows abundantly, it is eternal, it is not stopped, there is no end to its abundance. And that is our connection with God, with all of our minds, all of our hearts, all of our souls, and all of our strengths. So I want to look at each of those. First of all, crossing boundaries. Moving from other to self and self to other. Sometimes we have the illusion that love is easiest when we're with people who are like us. But Jesus invites us to love all others. And when another lawyer in Luke asked him to be more explicit, he told him exactly who he meant. He talked about a Samaritan in trouble who showed what love was like. But how do we get there? You know, it's easy to talk about what we need to do, but how do we get there? How do we get to that place of love? Parker Palmer talks about love as being fundamentally a communal experience, but community cannot take root in a divided life. Long before community assumes external shape and form, it must be present as a seed in the undivided life. Only as we are in community with ourselves can we find community with others. And I think about the story of Trinidad Herrera. She was a community organizer in the 1970s in Tondo, which is the largest slum in Manila. And she dedicated her life to working with the poorest of the poor, advocating and empowering and strengthening under a brutal dictatorship. And there was a time when her organizing work began to catch the attention of the military. And they began following her around. And so she left Tondo for a while to kind of cool down, and they kept following her. And eventually they arrested her. And they took her into custody. And they questioned her, and they tortured her. They attached electrodes to her hands and later to more sensitive parts of her body. And then when they didn't like the answer to the question, they would shoot a shock through her body until she cried and screamed out in pain and eventually began to reveal some information that she didn't want to reveal to give the names of some comrades that she worked with. And later on in prison, there gathered with all the rest of the political prisoners, she stayed isolated from them. She was confused and traumatized and ashamed that she had said things that she didn't want to say. And one day, they celebrated communion in that prison cell. Father Ed De La Torre, who was one of the prisoners with her in that prison, they gathered together in a circle and they began to break bread together and share in Holy Communion, and they surrounded her. They invited her into the circle and they brought her into the circle. And reflecting on that, Father Ed said that it was a remembering. The communion, which we'll celebrate in a few minutes, is a remembering. First of all, it's a remembering who we are. No matter what has happened to us, no matter what situations we've been in, remembering that we are children of God, remembering that we are made to love one another. But also it's a re-membering. It's those who have been excluded, remembered into the community. There was a physical, a mental, an emotional, and a spiritual remembering as she was brought back into the community. Now, many of us have experienced cracking under the stress. Our lives have been so tumultuous, so torturous, so difficult. We've gone through things that have taken us to places we didn't imagine we would go, and we have cracked under the pressure. We have betrayed brothers and sisters. We have said things we didn't want to say. We have raised our voice in anger. We have done things that have broken relationship. And we too have felt alienated and estranged, and we're not worthy to be a part of community. But the story of the gospel is that we are worthy because we are children of God. It's not something we earn. It's something that we receive by God's grace. And as we gather together in a community of grace, we can begin to build authentic community, as hard as it is, out of that place of knowing that we are loved and therefore can love. Society uprights divisions all around us, creates divisions of race and class and sexual orientation, gender, nationality, language, and so many more that are put out there to divide us, to keep us against one another, to pit us against one another. But M. Scott Peck defines love as extending oneself for the spiritual growth of oneself and another. Love is always an extending. Love is always a moving beyond the boundaries. Love is always a humble listening and a hearing one another and building community. This is a boundary-crossing church. We have established and set from the beginning our intention to be a boundary-crossing church. That this would be a space that no one owns. This is different than inclusion. This is different than diversity. There's too much of that out there. You know, where oftentimes everybody knows that the space is owned by somebody and they're willing to try to include a few folks as long as you conform to the culture. But a boundary-crossing church means that no one owns the space, that every person is equally entitled to bring all of who they are, to cross the boundaries, to hear one another, and to build beloved community. Crossing boundaries is the way of love, and so is setting boundaries. Once we have crossed artificial boundaries of division, we're invited to set boundaries of respect. There can be no powerful relationship without the setting of boundaries. And it's one of the greatest pitfalls in our relationships because we don't want to set boundaries. We're afraid to set boundaries. We're afraid that setting boundaries is going to make someone uneasy, that's going to create tension, that it's going to create stress. We're going to have to bring up something delicate. And we don't want to do that. So we'd rather just go along, and then when they do stuff that makes us mad, we just wonder why they can't read our minds. This is Palm Sunday, celebrated across the Christian world as the day, commemorating the day that Jesus marched into Jerusalem. Jesus came to Jerusalem to set some boundaries. That's why he came. He was very clear that things were out of control. And some of us may feel that things are out of control in America right now. I do. I feel like things are out of control. And where is the boundary? How many hateful things can you say in a presidential debate? How many people can you lift up and denigrate? How much violence can you foment before you've crossed a boundary? How do we establish boundaries? Jesus established boundaries by marching into the capital city and taking his band of followers and going into the Capitol building, which back then was called the temple. And going in, he set some boundaries. He said, this is supposed to be a place for all people, a place of God, a place of prayer where all people are included, but you have turned it into a den of robbers. You have crossed the boundary. You have gone out of control. And Jesus confronted the injustice of what was happening by the religious leaders. He quoted Isaiah and Jeremiah, prophetic setting of boundaries. This is supposed to be a house of prayer for all people. You have turned it into a den of robbers. What injustice do we need to confront in our society right now? What injustice needs to be confronted in our community? Our second principle at New Day after crossing boundaries is confronting injustice with the compassion and abundance of God. Setting boundaries is always a faith act. It's scary, but we do it in faith that things can be better. Not setting boundaries is assuming that things can't get better. Not setting boundaries is assuming that we have to stick with relationship that's less than we deserve. Setting boundaries is an act of faith. What are the boundaries that we need to set in our personal lives? Sometimes those can be the most difficult to set of all. The psychologist Brene Brown talks about a simple definition of boundaries as being what's okay and what's not okay. A simple stating of what's okay and what's not okay. I think about the story of Alexandra and Maria. When they first moved in together, some things began to emerge that weren't there when they were just dating. And one of the things that emerged is that Alexandra had occasionally would raise her voice when they had disagreements. And this was troubling to Maria. It felt disrespectful. Alexandra didn't think anything of it because all her life, her parents had always raised their voices, and they got along all right. That was just the way she understood relationship. When you're mad, you raise your voice. You yell, the other one yells, you get it all out, you make up, and then everything's fine. But that didn't feel all right for Maria. She wasn't used to that in her family. And so when it happened, she made it clear that it wasn't acceptable. That was not a way that she was willing to be in relationship. And Alexandra pushed back. She was a little aghast. What do you mean? It's not us. We might, all this kind of stuff. But she kept firm. And sometimes when we set boundaries, we have to stay a little firm. We have to kind of hang in there. We can hear each other. We need to be flexible. We need to negotiate, but we also need to step forward. If that's something that really bothers me, if that's something that feels disrespectful to me, if we're going to be in a relationship together and I'm going to tolerate that, then over time I'm going to begin to get resentful. And eventually the relationship is going to begin to crack. So if I'm going to establish the possibility of a relationship for a long time, a relationship that's for good, a relationship that's for life, even if we're going to be in relationship together as members of society, neighborhood, this happens at all different levels of our lives. But if we really care about relationship, if we really believe that our relationships can be loving, if we really want to build beloved community, we need to have the conversations with each other. We need to talk to each other, tell each other what's not okay, tell each other what's okay and what's not okay, and work it out. Now, once we have established boundaries of respect in our relationships, now we have set up a channel through which the love of God can flow. And a third characteristic I want to look at about love today is that love flows freely. This is the nature of love. When it's love, it's flowing freely. If we're trying to control it, trying to manipulate it, trying to guide it in some certain way, then it ceases to become love. Because love, by its very nature, flows freely. I want to read a quote from Richard Rohr, a Catholic priest that writes some powerful teaching about the gospel and about love. He says, true spirituality is about keeping your heart space open. That's the wrong quote. That comes later. But you can still keep your heart space open. Richard Rohr says, this love, whose source is God's very self, is an open-heartedness. You can tell when you're in that space, and once you get it, you're not satisfied with anything else. When you're in that open-hearted space, your energy is flowing out. When you're not in that space, your energy sucks inward. It's all about who did me wrong, who did this to me. But when we're in that space of God's love, our energy is flowing out because we begin to get that there is no bottom to the well of love. Love is of God. If we're trying to love people without connection to God, we may dry up because it's hard to love. It's hard to set boundaries. It's hard to cross boundaries. It's hard to have those conversations. There is stress that happens. There's tension that happens. It takes energy for us to have those kinds of conversations. Relationship is difficult. Building beloved community is hard. And if we try to do it on our own, more than likely we're going to dry up. But Jesus suggests, before he even talks about relationship with one another, before he even says, love your neighbor as yourself, he says, love God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength. Because that is the source from which we love. You know, in the best of circumstances, relationships are going to be challenging. Things are going to get said. There's hurt feelings going to happen. This is the nature of relationships. And it's very difficult for us when we're hurt to summon whatever is within us to forgive another, except that God has already forgiven us. When Jesus talks about love and prayer, pray that I will forgive, God, please forgive my sins as I forgive those who sin against me. It's receiving from that vast ocean, allowing the source of love to channel down through the boundaries that we've set, opening our hearts and receiving the love to overflowing that then allows us to share it with others. When we're receiving a love that has no end, we don't have to worry about holding on to it. We don't have to worry about, what's that word I'm thinking of? When you don't give people the whole thing? Rationing. We don't have to ration it. Because it's never ending. Now I can get to that other quote. True spirituality is about keeping your heart space open. It's hard daily work. The temptation is to close down, to judge and dismiss and hate and fear. If you don't have some spiritual practice that keeps your heart open, even in the midst of suffering, it's easy to end up grumpy and filled with fear and negativity. It takes work to live in love, to have generosity of spirit, readiness of smile, a willingness to serve, regularly checking in on ourselves, asking, is my heart open? Is love flowing from me? Or am I constricted? This is the key to our relationships with one another. That if we can live in the grace of undeserved love, if we can receive undeserved forgiveness, then we can indeed cross boundaries and set boundaries. We can indeed build beloved community with one another. What are the practices that keep your heart flowing with love? What are the things that you do in your life that intentionally connect you with the source of love? For me, prayer is key. I don't know how many of us have a daily practice of prayer. But to me, that's key. If God is the source of love, and if love is the most important thing that matters in my life, if those two things are true, then I'm going to want to have some connection to the source of love. I'm going to want to have some kind of daily connection. And I talk to folks all the time, and it's so hard to find 5 or 10 minutes to be in communion with God. Why is that? If we really want to be in connection with the source of love, if we want to be people of love, if that's what matters most, can we start with 5 minutes? Consistency is the key. Don't start with an hour the first day and then scrap it the next day because you just couldn't do it. Start with 5 minutes. Do 5 minutes a day for a week or 2 weeks and bump it up to 6 or 7. But a consistent, regular practice of prayer where we're just simply sitting, where we're just not focusing on the tasks, where we're opening our minds and our hearts and our souls and our strength to God. We're open to being surprised. We're open to allowing God's love to show up for us in ways we didn't see. And then weekly worship. 6 days a week, we're immersed in the busyness of the world. We're immersed in the tasks. We're guided around by whoever that person was in that quote that's got us by the hand and is saying, this is important, this is important, this is important. That's how we live so much of our days. But can we take a day a week where we focus on the source of love, where we come with total heart, total mind, total strength, total soul, all of who we are, and bring it into a place of beloved community? That's what we're about. That's what we've been about for 7 years, and that's what we're going to be about for 7 more years and 70 more years and 170 more years. That's what we're called to. We're called to set a big table. We're called to spread a sumptuous feast in a land that sometimes feels scarce. And there is a seat at the table for you. Let's open ourselves to God's Spirit in prayer. Gracious God, we open ourselves to the flow of your love. We open our minds. We open our hearts. We open our bodies, our emotions, our strength, our souls. Gracious God, we want to experience your love. We want to be attentive and realize that your forgiveness is just so wonderful, so that that love can just flow to others. Oh God, what is the particular way that you are calling me to love? What are my particular gifts? What is a way of love that you are inviting me into this week? Gracious God, we thank you for your grace. In Jesus' name, amen.